Hey guys, Paul here from Surf Ready Fitness, coming to you today because a study in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Association just dropped on surfing performance. I found a lot of the information in there super helpful. It goes over injury prevention, training protocols, a lot of different stuff. So the study was called A Comprehensive Needs Analysis on Surfing Performance Factors and Training Methodologies. So basically all these doctors got together and realize that surfing's gotten more popular over the last 20 years. So they're seeing a lot more competitive surfers do land-based surf training as well as non-competitive surfers. And they found that interesting. I didn't make that up. That's literally in the study. So they decided to run this study with a goal to provide a needs analysis of surfing components such as environmental factors, biomechanical and physiological demands, and current training methods for performance enhancement. They said the aim of this article is to provide a needs analysis of surfing components based on a current literature of the sport. The information presented in this article applies to surfers of all experience levels, recreational, competitive, and elite. However, it should be noted that most of the research has been attentive towards competitive surfers. The analysis will include environmental factors, biomechanical and physiological demands, and current training methodologies for surfers to improve their performance. Okay, so the first thing they looked at was the needs analysis, which is what factors play into the sport and what types of training should the athlete be doing for their sport, essentially. The first one that they went over was the environmental analysis, which includes weather patterns, coastline topography. Did I say that right? And tides. Okay, so the first one, surfing's physical and environmental demands. Environmental factors. So they said that the environmental factors play a critical role in surfing performance, like conditions of wave size, wind direction, tides, and coastline topography affect how challenging the surf will be. So, for example, a beach break with shifting sandbars creates inconsistent waves, while a point break with rocky reefs may provide more predictable waves. Next up, performance impact. So surfers need to adapt to these variables in real time. Cold water can also affect their psychomotor function. I actually found this really interesting. The colder the water, it slows down your reflexes and making balance more difficult. I think we kind of already knew that, though, right? The study also highlights that cold water's impact on postural control and dynamic balance. So this is critical for surfers in cold climates as it affects movement patterns like aerials and rapid maneuvers. Also talked about how wearing a wetsuit affects everything as well. So the importance of actual wetsuit thickness in colder waters could also be emphasized as it increases the energy required to paddle and perform maneuvers. So I think later in the study, it talks about how if you have a competitive surfer that you're working with, if they are surfing a wave, could be like a reef break or a point break or beach break, and if they're wearing a wetsuit, their conditioning training should actually play a part in that. So you might want to actually work on more endurance stuff in the gym to help with the more energy expenditure because of the colder water and the thicker wetsuit. All right, next up are the 5 phases of surfing. They basically looked at the sport and broke it down into 5 different phases. Those phases are paddling, the takeoff, which they call the pop-up, wave riding, stationary phase, essentially when you're just sitting on your board in the lineup, and then miscellaneous movements, which would be, I think, like jogging down the beach to like paddle back out. Okay, so going back to the first one, paddling. This is the most time-consuming part of surfing, accounting for around 42 to 54% of the activity. It requires upper body endurance and strength, particularly in the shoulders, triceps, and latissimus dorsi. Poor paddling mechanics like excessive trunk extension can lead to lower back injuries and muscle recruitment during paddling, especially how scapular mechanics and muscle imbalances in the shoulders, like impingement risks, need to be addressed. So basically just talking about the mechanics of paddling, which muscles you're using, and then also if you have like a shoulder impingement that it could impede your paddling endurance or paddling power. Secondly, the takeoff, which would be the pop up. They call that the explosive phase. The explosive phase when surfers sprint paddle to catch a wave and pop up onto their feet. This requires coordination, upper body strength, and core stability, which we already know. You can highlight how dynamic push-ups and plyometric drills can help surfers improve this movement. This is the most challenging phase for recreational surfers and requires a high level of dynamic strength, mobility, and neuromuscular control to complete this movement pattern. I think we kind of already knew that. I get messages all the time from people that essentially, I don't want to say old people, but people that have gotten older, have been out of the water longer, and their kind of body starts to break down. So I get at least a message weekly from someone saying, hey, I can't pop up anymore. Can you help me pop up? So it is obviously one of the more difficult movements. So just getting to your feet is obviously vital and super important to obviously performing on the wave. Next up, wave riding. They said once on the wave, the demand shifts to the lower body, so surfers need powerful legs to generate speed and perform maneuvers like carves and aerials. Not all of us are doing aerials. Also, anticipate and reactive balance is essential for maintaining control on the wave's face. Greater lower body isometric strength was significantly related to eccentric leg strength and greater neuromuscular activation in the muscle tendon unit, resulting in the capability to withstand longer wave duration with maneuvering. Also, higher ankle range of motion in competitive surfers with also higher dynamic postural control. I found this really interesting actually because it talks about competitive surfers actually have better ankle range of motion than recreational surfers. So if you are a competitive surfer, obviously the needs are going to be range of motion and then also a lot of neuromuscular control along with lower body strength, which I think we already knew. There's obviously a lot of ways to go about achieving those results. All right, next up, stationary phase and then the miscellaneous phase. They said about the stationary phase, though it seems passive, sitting or lying on the board waiting for waves, actually requires core stability, which we already knew. Recreational surfers might not engage their core as effectively, which can cause instability when transitioning from this phase back to paddling. And then miscellaneous movements talks about duck diving and running back to the lineup. So efficient energy expenditure is key here, especially in competitive settings where time is limited during heats. All right, next up is the physiological analysis. There is a lot of information here, but basically what I gathered from this, which I already knew, and you might as well, is that basic cardiovascular training needs to be included in any training program for surfers, as well as anaerobic training, which is essentially sprint paddling, or if you're paddle battling somebody, I guess if you're a competitive surfer, or just trying to get into a wave would be considered anaerobic. So again, they measured heart rate, and again, there's a lot of information, but my general consensus from this is that cardiovascular training, so aerobic and anaerobic work needs to be included in both programs. All right. Next up, they talked about injury assessments and prevention, which I thought was really cool. They provided a table. So basically what they did is they broke it down by surf demand. So the takeoff or pop up, and then next up paddling, then wave riding, and then stationary. So basically what they did was they did an assessment in a research lab and broke down all of these things. And so then they talked about suggested injury prevention exercises, and that's what I want to speak on real quick. So for the pop-up, a variation of push-up exercises will help, as well as dynamic movement and flexibility. So a lot of yoga poses, including downward dog, cobra stretch, lizard stretch, pigeon stretch, kneeling lunge stretch, and then some dynamic movement patterns, Turkish get-ups, and burpees, which I love. We do those so much in our classes here. I do them with all the pros I work with too. It's just so great to see it actually on paper in a research study. I love that they included this type of stuff. Okay, so for paddling, Again, dynamic movement, flexibility exercises, cobra pose, child's pose, sleeper stretch, doorway pectoralis stretch, parascapular and rotator cuff progressive resistance exercises. So for paddling, essentially shoulders is going to be a big one, and then also lower back. They talked about in here as well. Wave riding, injury prevention exercises include various dynamic balance exercises. So your BOSU exercises, your endo board exercises, eyes closed exercises. A lot of stuff on unstable surfaces will help. Also talked about sumo squat, warrior poses, deep lateral lunges, and then general core exercises. And then lastly, stationary. They just mentioned general core exercises for injury prevention. All right, so that was number 2, which was the 5 phases of surfing and injury prevention. And now let's get into training for surfers. So basically, they talked about how important land-based training is, finally. But they emphasize how land training helps surfers develop strength, endurance, and flexibility needed for ocean performance. Exercises targeting the shoulders, core, and legs can improve a surfer's ability to paddle faster, pop up quickly, and execute maneuvers efficiently. Core strength. They talked about the importance of exercises like Turkish get-ups, planks, and dynamic movements like burpees that simulate the pop-up movement. Plyometric exercises like box jumps and squat jumps can help improve lower body power for turns and aerial maneuvers. Love all that. Then they talked about upper body endurance, so activities like swimming, rowing, or using a paddle ergometer can help build upper body stamina needed for long sessions. And then dynamic postural control, which I found really interesting because there's not a ton of research out there on this stuff, but I feel like more and more is popping up. So in this study, they talked about the importance of tests like the Y balance test or the Star Excursion Balance Test, otherwise known as the SEBT. They use these tests to measure dynamic balance. So those tests were really important to this study. You can also use these tests, it says, at your own convenience if you want to kind of see what your dynamic balance looks like. Next up, they talked about aerobic versus anaerobic training, and I already touched on this earlier about how important training for both are. Just essentially think of them as energy systems. They said both aerobic and anaerobic conditioning are crucial for surfing, and this includes the need for sprint paddles, which would be anaerobic, and then longer paddling, which would be aerobic. Okay, because we're still talking about training for surfers, there was a slide in this study, a really big slide where they talked about surfing demands, the energy systems, or motions required for each demand. Remember, the demands is like paddling, taking off, riding the wave, or stationary. And then general conditioning exercise examples, which I thought was really cool. And then they also threw in some sport-specific exercise examples, which I found really interesting. So let's run through those real quick, starting at paddling. General conditioning exercise examples are parascapular resistance, ITYs, which you can do on a stability ball with dumbbells or without any of that stuff. It's a really great exercise. Push-ups, they put bench press in here. Don't love bench press for surfers, but I can see why they put this in the study. Pull-ups, lat pull-downs, TRX resistance exercises, general core activation, thoracic, lumbar, a lot of mobility exercises for the spine. And the sport-specific exercise examples they used are upper body ergometer, rowing machine. I know I'm saying that wrong. Spider-Man push-ups, Supermans, prone plank, and alternating dumbbell rows. So I love that stuff. Okay, next up would be the takeoff or pop-up. General conditioning exercise examples include open chain, hip flexion, extension, resistance exercises, general core activation exercises, split squats, single leg RDLs. We do those almost every day in here. General trunk and lower extremity mobility exercises, and then plyometrics. I love plyometrics for surfers. I don't think it gets talked about enough. We do it a lot in our classes. Do a deep dive on plyometrics, okay, if you want more information on that. They've been around forever. They are top tier, in my opinion. Okay, and then sport-specific exercise examples for popping up. push-ups with mountain climbers, burpees, says surfer variations. We do surf stance burpees in here, so maybe that's kind of what they're referring to. Prone hip flexion with Swiss ball, split squat jumps, and then runner starts. Okay, let's see what they have. Okay, for wave riding, here are their top conditioning exercise examples: squats, shrimp squats, deadlifts, lateral lunges, single leg balance, eyes open or closed, and unstable and unstable surfaces. Love that. Medicine ball throws for trunk rotation. We do those all the time too. And then general core activation exercises. And then here are some surf specific examples: star excursion. That was the test that I mentioned earlier. Single leg balance for trunk rotations, chops and lifts with cable column, dynamic balance activities. They mentioned a BOSU. I see endo board here. And then acrobatic training, only for advanced and competitive surfers. All right, I'm going to talk about the injury prevention up next. Not going to spend a lot of time on this because there wasn't a ton of information shared. But they talked about common injuries. They said shoulder injuries from paddling is super common. Also, impingements or scapular impingements or injuries are very common, as is a lower back pain from prolonged hyperextension during paddling. They just mentioned it's important for surfers to balance muscle development between the anterior, which is the front of your body, and then the posterior, which is the back of your body. And then they said training for balance. Injury prevention programs should include exercises like scapular strengthening, rows and external rotations, core stability drills, anti-rotation movements, and flexibility routines. Then they also mentioned cold weather surfing, which I mentioned earlier in the video. And it just says, like, for those surfing in colder climates, and those people that are using heavier wetsuits can increase their energy required to paddle and perform maneuvers. So the surfers need to account for this in their strength training routines. So adding resistance training to help offset the extra effort needed. So what I'm taking away from that is, like, people who are surfing in colder waters are going to need more resistance training programs to complement the amount of effort that they're going to have to exude while they're paddling. All right, number 5, importance of flexibility and balance. So they said flexibility is obviously especially important in the lower body, particularly around the hips and ankles. Surfers with greater ankle range of motion tend to perform better, especially during aerials and landings. Incorporate flexibility routines like yoga poses to improve joint mobility. We already knew that. Okay, balance. Dynamic balance tests like the Y balance test or the SEBT, which I mentioned earlier, are great indicators of a surfer's ability to maintain control on their board. Balancing exercises that mimic surfing movements, such as wobble boards or stability balls, can help surfers develop reactive stability. Nothing mentioned about surf skating in here. I'm not going to touch on it, but just saying it wasn't mentioned in this study. And then performance impact. Surfers with better balance and flexibility can transition faster during the takeoff phase and land more complex maneuvers, making them more competitive. All right, then it just mentioned practical training advice. It says exercises to recommend. For upper body strength, push-ups, pull-ups, and lat pull-downs to build paddling power. For lower body power, squats, lunges, and plyometric box jumps for better wave riding and faster turns. For flexibility, incorporate yoga-based stretches focusing on the hips, hamstrings, and shoulders. For balance and core stability, wobble board exercises, single leg RDLs, and dynamic planks. All right, so let's wrap this up. I know it was a long video. Basically, at the end of the study, they were like, hey, here's basically general consensus, and here's what we've gathered. Surf training should be tailored to the surfer's experience level. Competitive surfers have better strength, mobility, and motor skills due to frequent land-based training and more time in the water. They already possess the necessary physical foundation, so strength coaches should focus on refining and maintaining their athletic performance. Competitive surfers are judged higher for performing advanced maneuvers like aerials and rapid turns, so their training should include plyometrics and acrobatic movements. Recreational surfers, however, benefit from basic strength, balance, flexibility, and aerobic training to build foundational skills. So, what I'm gathering from this, and probably what you should too, is really just stick to the basics. I see too much stuff online with people doing all sorts of crazy shit and jumping off trampolines and kicking stability balls and doing all this dumb shit, where stick to the basics, do plyos, work on your flexibility, your upper body and lower body strength. Okay. Um, Only competitive surfers need to be doing these acrobatic or aerial maneuvers. They've already mastered those things. They're really just trying to refine the skills. So don't go crazy and try to learn all this stuff without actually building a solid foundation of strength, mobility, flexibility, and endurance. And I think that wraps it up, guys. I'm happy to discuss these results with you. If you want to comment on the post, send me a DM, shoot me an email. I'm happy to share the study with you. I thought it was very informational. Feel like I knew a lot of this stuff already, but it was really great just to see a bunch of doctors get together and go, hey, this is what you should be doing, which I've been doing for 20 years. So yeah, if you're still watching the video, thanks for sticking around and have a great day. Thanks, guys.